Right, so we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Medieval Storytime with the creative Contessa. I am the Contessa. I have some very fun, informative, illuminating, and extremely bawdy readings for us today. I apologize for the tardiness of our commencement. I got distracted by something and lost track of time. Anyway, so first up, we shall have a series of contrasts today. We shall have a reading from our favorite book of caring, John Russell's Book of Nurture, specifically as to the duties of a pantler/butler in the 15th century, which actually contains a very fascinatingly detailed set of instructions for tapping a wine barrel in the 15th century. We shall also be proceeding from the idea of how you get the wine out of the barrel to a place where you drink the wine, specifically one of the grandest wedding celebrations in history, the wedding festivities for Margaret of York and Charles the Bold in 1468 in Bruges, a 14-day wedding feast. We're not going to read the whole wedding feast because obviously that would be a lot of chronicles, but we are going to explore one of the chronicles detailing a part of said wedding feast. Then I have selected for your delectation a very bawdy tale from the Decameron, another bawdy tale, to further counter the very false narrative of the Middle Ages as a time of prudishness and puritanical attitudes. Yeah. Good evening, Susan. Lovely to see you this evening. So we have quite a bit of fun planned. In honor of me doing a reading from Boccaccio's Decameron, I decided to dress alla Fiorentina this evening. And as I get dressed, I thought I would address a comment that I received under my post, the post I just made about the larded milk that we concocted together yesterday and the day before. A native speaker of Italian very kindly offered that I had forgotten the I in Zabaglione because I spelt it the way it is spelt in the 15th century Neapolitan manuscript. So I thought this would be a good chance for me to clarify that I is not in the original manuscript because, one, it's the dialect that is spoken in Napoli, not Tuscan. Two, it's the 15th century, and spelling is not even a little bit uniform. But also, I don't even know that there was an I in any of the versions of that word in the 15th century. Orthography evolves over time, and if you're reading a historical post about a historical word, never assume that it's misspelt. It's probably safer to assume it's being spelt in the historical fashion. But it was kindly meant. It was not a criticism by the poster, and it offered me, the commenter, it offered me a very good opportunity to address the idea of medieval or pre-modern orthography pretty much anywhere in Europe not being standardized. And it just wasn't. Many of you have often heard me say curdle and it's 20 spellings, right? Even the Gamora, right? This has at least 3 spellings that I've seen, probably 4, varying between whether there's a G and a K, varying whether there's an O or a U, whether there's 1 R's or 2 R's, 1 M or 2 M's. So that's actually probably at least 6 spellings now that I think about it. So yeah, you just can't count on modern spelling conventions applying in a pre-standardized context. Takeda, lovely to see you. Welcome. Emra, thank you for joining us. So as I was saying, I do have some very fun things planned. We will have a reading from the Book of Nurture, where we will address how to tap into a wine barrel in the 15th century. Also, how to serve bread at the table and who gets what caliber of bread in the feast hall. We will also be exploring Margaret of York's, oh my God, opulent feast, 14-day wedding feast in Bruges. Bruges really went all out to fete the new Duchess of Burgundy. And this is another one of those feasts. festivities that I would dearly love to recreate, maybe even more so than the Feast of the Pheasant, honestly, because unlike the Feast of the Pheasant, which is not celebrating anything, but is instead basically a call to war, the wedding is a celebration, and there's plenty of jocularity and pleasure and enjoyment to be had. So I think maybe I would prefer to recreate Margaret of York's wedding feast if I had the budget. I would only need $20 million probably, you know, including all of the clothing for everyone, appropriate clothing for everyone, the attire that she and Charles, her new spouse, wore, all of the settings, the stage pieces, all the amazing food, 14 days of it, decorating the entire city in tapestries. Yeah, I had someone try to tell me that, oh, the Feast of the Pheasant would have only been about $300,000 in modern money, and like that does not include the clothing for all of the guests. When I say I want to recreate it, I mean I want everything to be exactly right, or as exactly right as we can get it modernly. So yeah, I would need one hell of a budget for that. One hell of a budget indeed. So this is a Gamora in the Florentine style. Depending on whether you think this fabric is really splendid or not, it might be listed in the inventories as a cotta, C-O-T-T-A, another word that has several different spellings in 15th century Italian. It's just sort of a plain, basic striped silk, so I'm not certain. Probably it would be called a cotta, because pretty much everything that's silk in Florence is referred to as a cotta, and anything in wool is referred to as a gamora. Or maybe there might even be some linen gamore that are referenced. It's kind of hard to tell because in some cases they just say fabric. They don't say what kind of fabric. They just say panno. Okay, so I'm going to, I actually did remember my kerchief, my kuffia this time. So I will actually be donning my kuffia. Let me just see. Angelica, lovely. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I'm just going to toss my braids over my head like so. We've got quite a fun plan. Oh, and the reading from the Decameron. Oh my goodness. Super body. What a fun story. Oh my goodness. You know, I didn't even bother looking, watching a single episode of the thing they came out that was called the Decameron on Netflix. They definitely did not capture the book at all. They did something really weird. They took the frame characters and made the frame characters act like disgusting, nasty people with no manners. But in the original story, the frame characters are very well-mannered aristocrats. They are not bawdy, lewd people. But in contrast, they tell these stories that are incredibly bawdy and lewd, right? And that's sort of the point, right? Boccaccio did that on purpose. He gave it an elegant, genteel frame. He created this elegant, genteel frame for what was about to be a lot of stories that were none of that. And so I think they completely missed the mark on Netflix's Decameron, aside from the clothing being OMG, so bad. So very, very bad. I swear to God, they just went to IKEA and bought some lampshades for headdresses, for instance. Okay, excellent. Well, we are ready to get down to our story time. So we shall start with something rather elegant. And I'm just going to check the comments. Okay. So, first book from which I'm going to be reading has been attacked by my cats. See? Lovely, huh? Right. I did feed them. They have been fed. They do have food. They should not bother us, I don't think. So the first book that we're going to be reading is from, this is actually a reprint, Kessinger Legacy reprints, and this is out of copyright material, so it's free for any publisher to reprint, which is why a bunch of these 19th century antiquarian books are being reprinted and available for pretty inexpensively now. So it's a good time to be doing medievalism, let me tell you. So this is a series of books of etiquette that were compiled and published at the end of this, sort of the last quarter of the 19th century. And this compilation actually includes The Book of Nurture by John Russell, roughly the 1460s, the Book of Caring by Wynkyn de Worde, sort of a little bit later in the 15th century, a later edition of the same Book of Nurture as well. So you can actually see how the Book of Nurture actually is picked up and then evolved over about 100-year period. So it is a reprint in the literal sense. So you can tell that they literally just scanned the original and then printed it. It is not retypeset or anything like that. Therefore, there are, even the glosses are in some cases a little strange because it's 19th century academic English, right? So we've actually already read several passages, several sets of instructions from this book. We read together the section on table manners with the alarming things against which diners are warned. Remember, one of the more alarming things for me was don't spit over the table. If you need to expectorate, do so upon the floor and use your foot to grind it into the rush mats. Ew. You can see that if you go back. This is episode, I don't know, something of Medieval Storytime. That was, I think, in our first Medieval Storytime. So if you go look at Medieval Storytimes, you can hear the reading from that book of etiquette, from that section on table manners. It was delightfully disgusting in some cases, but it was also very illuminating because it showed both the sorts of behaviors in which people were obviously engaging, while also showing what was the desired outcome. And the desired outcome illustrates very clearly that 15th century people had standards and that they wanted an elegant table and they wanted polite interactions, and they weren't interested in even what by modern standards would be disgusting expressions of poor education, as they say. So then we also went through a passage that talked about how to dress your souverain, your lord. Conversely, probably also how to dress one's dame, but we don't know because, of course, this is written by a man for men. But you can just assume that any of the instructions that apply to the male version of the role probably apply equally to the female version of the role, right? Then we read the passage about how to draw a bath for your souverain, and also how to undress your souverain and prepare them for bed and also for a nap. So we're now up to the role of the pantler and the butler. So let me give you some background information about the pantler and the butler. In the 15th century, pantler and butler are in England and in smaller households the same job often. They're not always occupied by two separate people. In great royal households, they might be two separate jobs. Technically, butler, the word butler, Butler, there's like, again, 10 spellings in the 15th century, comes from the French word, the root word is botte, bottle. Botelier is the cupbearer, the person who would bear the king's cup, or the sovereign lord's cup. And that eventually turned into more than just a question of you're holding the cup for them and they drink from it when you hand it to them. It became the person who managed the bottles, the wine, the butts, the barrels, who managed the barrels, right? And the barrels of wine specifically. And so the butler then not only handled the serving of the wine, but the management of what we would call a wine cellar these days, right? So to make sure to order wine, to check its quality, to be also in charge of the staff below him who might serve at a feast, for instance. But the butler is the head position, and the butler himself would then have direct access to the sovereign. So it was a very desirable position. And in royal households, the job of butler was actually often occupied by a count or a duke or some high-ranking nobleman. So it wasn't just some random smith off the streets that they kind of pulled in and said, you're now the butler. It was a very skilled, and as you're going to find out, a very skilled position that was entrusted to someone of rank and station. Pantler, the word pantler, pan, bread, panum, from the Latin bread, and that's kind of all the Romance languages, the word for bread has that root, right? P-A-N. So the pantler was actually originally the person in charge of the bread supply. In some cases, the word pantler is also synonymous with baker in the 15th century, but not as often as it refers to the job of the person who manages the bakery. And that doesn't mean that they're doing the baking in the household. They're the ones just making sure that there is a steady supply of bread, that the right kind of bread is ordered for the right rank of people within the household, because the household, of course, is not just like mother, children, grandchildren, grandparents. The household is the sovereign, their family, and then their servants, their retainers, and those retainers all have their own hierarchy, many of them being noble themselves. So depending on your rank in the household would depend on the quality of bread that you actually got. And as you're going to find out, also how old the bread was that you got. So yeah, in by the 15th century, it seems that in some households, the butler and the pantler were the same position. They did both. They managed both the wine reserves and the supply of bread. Yeah. So I think those are the preparatory stuff I wanted to lay out. So the format on this is I'm going to read it in the original 15th century English. So it's going to have a certain rhythm to it. You won't necessarily understand all of the words because I will be applying 15th century English pronunciation rules, but there'll be a certain musicality to it. So at first, we're just going to do a read through for the beauty of the music of the language, and then we will go back through and we will discuss all the parts, and I will clarify words that I know most of you will probably not know. And why do I know that? Because when I was preparing this text for you all, I had to look up a bunch of words. Thankfully, online, there is a fantastic Middle English dictionary maintained by the University of Michigan, which has a fantastic medieval studies department. And you can I was able to find all the words that were unknown to me in that dictionary, and it provides primary source references for the words. So not only a definition, but then you can see it in context. And of course, you will be not surprised to hear maybe when I tell you that for all the words that I looked up, one of the references was at least this text. So yeah. So that means I'm going to do a clean read through. I will not look at the chat. I will not read the chat. So save all your questions for the end of the first read through. Then I will look at the chat, we'll answer questions, and then we will go back through line by line and discuss and elucidate exactly what's happening here. Okay, let me just check the chat now. Yeah, basically, Susan, exactly. So Susan says, is a butler like a Ganymede? Yeah, yes, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. Another question, is this before the short bodice look that made you look pregnant? Kat, so you're talking about the high waist, right? So referring to my clothing. So waistlines kind of go up and down over the centuries. So the waistline in Italy first starts moving upward towards the end of the 14th and into the early 15th century. So that's the first time you see an up-level waistline, and then they start wearing belts right under the breasts, right over their cote, over their chope, or their what the French would call an houppelande, right? But then as the 15th century wears on, the waist starts dropping bit by bit by bit in Florence specifically. And then when you get to the 1470s, the waist is almost at natural level. By the 1480s, the waist is at your natural waist. Not in Venice, though. In Venice, the waistline stays right below the breast. So it's really, when people think of the Juliet look, they're really thinking of like 1490s Venetian fashion is what they're thinking of, honestly. So yeah, so in 1480s, 1470s, 80s, and 90s Florence, the waist is getting closer or reaches the natural level. Yeah, so Kat, good question. Good question. Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead and commence then with our text. Let me just think one moment if there was anything else I really wanted to prep you with. No. Okay, so here we go. Here we go. Oh, for those who don't know, John Russell has written this book for his son, technically. So this is written not quite like a Socratic dialogue because there's no one talking back. His son never asks questions, but it is written like a conversation, or no, like a lecture, the father is lecturing his son, whom he is training to take over these positions very clearly. So That's why you're going to hear references to Sonna, his son, right? That's why. So here we go. No, son, if I thee teacher, wilt thou anything leere? Wilt thou be a servant, plowman or labourer, courtier or a clerk, marchand or mason or an artificiere, chamberlain or butler, pantler or carver? The officer of butler, sir, truly, pantera or chamberlain, the conning of a carver especially, of that I would learn faina. All of these a conning is to have, I say now in certena, I should pray for your soul never to come in pain. Son, I shall teach thee with the right goodwill, so that thou love God and dread, for that is right and skill. And to thy master be true, his goddess that thou not spill, but him love and dread, and his commandment do fulfill. The first year, my son, thou shalt be pantler or butler. Thou must have 3 canifes cane in pantry, I say thee evermore. On canife thee lovest to chop, another of them for to para, the third sharp and cane, to smooth the trenchers on square. Always thy sovereignest bread thou chop, and that it be new and able. Say all other bread a day old, or thou chop to the table. All household bread 3 days old, so it be profitable. And trencher bread 4 days is convenient and agreeable. Look, thy salta be sutila, witta, fair, and dreia, and thy planere for thy salta shall be made of iveri. The bread thereof inches 2, then the length incha told 3, and thy salt cellar lid touch not thy salt by. Good son, look that thy nappary be soota, and also fair and clean. Board cloth, towel, napkin, folding alla bedena. Brechti polished your table knefe, semely in sicht to sena. And thy spoon is fair, ye washer, ye wot well what I mean. Look, thou have taris too, a more and lesser for weena. Weena cannas according to the taris of box fetisa and fina. Also, a gimlet sharper to brocha and persa, sona to torna and tweena, with faucet and hampina ready to stop when thee sitema. So when thou settest a pipe of brucha, good sona, do after my Laura, 4 finger over the nera tina, thou may persa or bora. With tarera or gimlet persa thee upward, the pipa shora, and so shall thee not cause the lees up to rise, I warn you evermore. So, yeah, Richard, welcome. Yes, so that's the end. So I can now look at the questions and comments. Is this the same John Russell who was the Sheriff of Herefordshire and Chancellor to King Richard III? It may have been. I actually know nothing about John Russell, but that would make him contemporary with Richard III. And considering the way he writes, it would make sense that he would have had a deep understanding of the roles of servants in a royal household. So it could be, but I don't know, Richard. A good question. Right. Okay, so lots of good things in there. Lots of really fun things, lots of fun words, and lots of fun details. Right. So basically, the son, I said there's no dialogue, and then there is. So there is. It actually starts off with the father saying, son, if I teach you, is there anything you want to learn specifically? Do you want to learn to be a servant or a plowman or a laborer, a courtier or a clerk, a merchant or a mason or an artificer? Do you want to be a chamberlain or a butler or a pantler or a carver? He says. And then the son says, actually, I would like to learn about the office of the butler, pantler, or chamberlain, and also the knowledge, the skills of a carver, the koninga of a carver, right? He'd like to learn all of that. So just a few things, just a few things, Dad. If you can just explain to me these 4 simple to do jobs, right? And then he moves on and he says, so if you want to be a pantler or a butler, right? The first year, my son, ye shall be a pantler or a butler. So what he's saying is, so what he's implying, so we're learning something here about the hierarchy in the household. So all of these things that the son is learning, there is apparently, you don't get to be a chamberlain before you serve as a pantler or a butler in the first year, he says. The first year, my son, thou shalt be pantler or butler. Butler. Buttilare. Welcome to 15th century orthography. Isn't it grand? Right. So the first year, you basically have to serve as a pantler or a butler, right? And he says, and then basically these roles, he treats them like they're the same roles, acknowledging that in many households someone was doing double duty, probably. He says, thou must have a 3 canifes cana. So you must have 3 sharp knives. 3 sharp knives. So if you're a pantler or a butler, you have to have 3 sharp knives, and you make sure you always have them, always have access to them. Make sure they're always ready to go. And he says, one of the knives, ona knife, the loaves to chop. The loaves to chop. Loaves, loaves of bread. So one of them is for slicing the bread. One of them is for slicing the bread. Another them for to para. None of them is for paring the bread. Right. So does anyone know why you might need to pare your bread? Does anyone have an idea why you would pare your bread like you would pare fruit? Does anyone, can you guess why you might need to pare your bread like you would pare fruit? Right. Well, there's a slight lag in the chat, so I will go ahead and answer, but go ahead and pop it in the chat if you knew what it was. So bread in this era is baked in an oven, absolutely. But that oven has ash in it. It is not baked on a rack. It is not protected from the ash that comes from the fire. And the way ovens work is you build bread ovens. Historical ovens work. You build a fire, you bring the oven up to temperature, and then you actually scrape out the fire because the oven retains the heat. So there isn't fire in the oven necessarily. And you do scrape it out, but there's still going to be ash. There is still going to be ash, and there still might be some spots that burn a little or get a little overly dark. And so you need to pare the loaves so that you can pare away any of the burnt parts, any of the parts that are too ashy, for instance. So you need a knife that is for slicing, and you need a knife that is for paring. And anyone who's ever pared fruit, you know that the knife that you slice your bread with is definitely not the knife that you would want to use to pare your bread. It would be probably a recipe. It would be an interesting and unpleasant way to pare your thumb, probably, if you tried to use the knife that you would use to slice a heavy loaf of bread. And that's the other thing. You have to imagine this bread is more than likely sourdough. It's not been leavened. You couldn't just go and buy a packet of yeast at Ye Old Mercer. This would be a sourdough. So it's going to be denser, even if it's for the Lord and it's pain de main. So it's made with white flour, sifted flour, right? Even still, it's going to be denser. The crust is going to be much thicker and much harder and much less easily to work with than a fluffy modern loaf of bread. So you're going to need a really serious knife to cut it, and you're going to need a pretty good knife to pare it. Yeah. So 2 knives so far. You need your slicing knife and you need your paring knife. And then this is the really interesting one. The third sharpa and cana to smooth the trenchers and square. Right? So this is actually referencing bread trenchers for eating. So people often ask me, when did they stop using bread trenchers? I'm not certain when they stopped, But in England, at least in the end of the 15th century, they are still using bread trenchers. Now, actually, if I really wanted to answer that question, I could flip forward to the end of the book with the 1560s edition of the Book of Nurture and see if they still reference the whole bread trencher thing, right? But at least in the 1470s, they are still using bread trenchers. And that's why you need the third knife. So the pantler's job is to slice and pare the bread, but also to make the trenchers for the meal, right? Because he says you need the third sharp and keen to smooth the trenchers and make them square. Which also tells us that the trencher isn't round, it's square, right? To square up the trenchers. Yeah, so his son, Richard's comment is, so his son, John Russell's son, had to take menial work in order to move up the ladder. Exactly. The idea is that the Chamberlaina is kind of in charge of everything, basically all of these servants ultimately. And I think, honestly, it's a practical idea of, if you're going to be in charge, you have to know all the major jobs, right? You have to, it's like a business apprenticeship in Germany these days, right? You move through all the different departments so that you can understand what each of the departments does before, taking up a managerial position. Same idea here. Same idea. Yep, exactly, Richard. So you have your 3 different bread knives for slicing, paring, and for making trenchers. And here we have, unexpectedly, documentary evidence that trenchers are still being used and that are common and in high-level households. This is not some peasant eating on bread trenchers. This is a noble household that we're talking about. So 1470s bread trenchers are still very much a thing. Now, one of the things that they did, especially for those of the upper ranks in this era, in France and England and Italy as well, is you would actually put your bread trencher on top of those really pretty metal trenchers that you see laid out on the tables. So I actually have a theory now, having eaten off of reproduction metal trenchers, that especially with the level of acidity in medieval cuisine, that the metal trencher was there, 1, conspicuous consumption, but 2, it protected the tablecloth from any drippings and sauce and whatnot. So you would actually prepare your bread trencher, square it up to fit on those square metal trenchers. I do have one here and I should have thought to bring it with me. I'm sorry, I have failed you all with today's medieval story time. I do have a replica medieval trencher. I'll see if I can post pictures of it. If you'd like to see a picture of a replica 15th century metal trencher, post it in the comments under the video after this publishes, and that will remind me to post the picture in my various walls and community posts and whatnot. Anyway, so you're supposed to square up the bread so that it fits on top of the trencher, and then the bread makes certain that none of those acidic sauces actually end up, interacting with the metal, because especially the medieval trenchers, which probably had lead in them, you really don't want the acid leaching that out into your food. That's what I think. That's what I think is probably going on here, that the wealthy could afford those nice, pretty metal trenchers, or the well-to-do, those with more disposable income, could afford a nice metal trencher to go under the bread trencher, to be extra fancy, making the metal trencher basically the modern equivalent of a charger. Yeah. Right. Okay. So he then says, "Alway thy sovereignes bread thou toppe, and that it be newe and able." Right. So always slice your sovereign's bread from the new loaf of bread, from a fresh loaf of bread. So there's a hierarchy we're about to experience here. So the souveraine gets fresh bread, freshly baked bread. So the fresh bread goes to the sovereign. And then he says, "The other bread a day old, or thou toppe to the table," right? So what that means is, for the other members of the household, the others, so all other, right? Who knows what this other is, because there's yet more people. But some other group gets bread that's a day old. And then for the house, and I think this might be the servants, right? So maybe like the higher ranking retainers get bread that's a day old. And then it says, "All a household bread 3 days old." right? So the sort of the lower members of the general household, the employees of the household, basically, they get bread that's 3 days old. So the suzerain gets the fresh bread, his higher ranking retainers get day old bread, and then the general household, the servants, they get the old bread, the 3 days old bread. Yeah. So what about Maiolica, Warren-like chargers and tureens? I have not seen Maiolica as a charger in the 15th century. I haven't seen evidence of that myself. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. I just haven't seen it. I haven't seen that kind of evidence for 15th century Italy, for parts of 15th century Italy. Okay, so sovereign gets fresh bread, higher ranking retainers get day old bread, the rest get 3 day old bread, and then he says, and trencher bread 4 days is convenient and agreeable, right? So trenchers are made from 4 day old bread, is what he says. Now, maybe also from 5 and 6 day old bread, who knows? But the implication could also be by day 5, you can't do crap with it anymore. Make sure you use it by day 5. Any of you who've lived in Germany, right, and you've gotten proper German sourdough bread, right, like the Roggenbrot or Dunkelbrot or, yeah, Bauernbrot, for instance. By day 5, and wonderful German sourdough loaves. They will last a good long time, and they generally won't mold before you eat them. But they will dry out to the point where they're so hard and that you can't do much with it because there's nothing in it keeping it fresh. There's no chemicals keeping the bread fresh, right? So yeah. Okay, questions or comments? So, right, moving on then. Now we get to an unexpected job for the pantler and the butler. Salt. Lucca thy salta bisutila, vita, fera, and ria. Look that your salt is, so sutila means subtle, the word that eventually becomes subtle, S-U-B-T-L-E, here is spelled S-U-T-I-L-L-E, and it actually means quality, refined, so of good quality. So make sure your salt is of good quality, that it's white, so that it is good quality and white, which also possibly means it comes from a specific kind of salt source, or that it has been purified. There's actually recipes in various various recipe collections that provide instructions for whitening your salt, right? And that it's fera, which means it's in good condition, and dry, right? Because the acknowledgement here is that salt is hydrophilic and it will turn into a wet mess if it comes down to it. So you need to make sure it's dry. Okay, hold on a minute. The flour used in those days probably wasn't that great because it soured too quickly. When was yeast used? You mean when was the dry yeast? When was that invented? I don't know. That's probably a 19th century thing. You could sometimes, even in the Middle Ages, if you lived near a brewer, like very near a brewer, you could go to the brewer and actually get fresh yeast also. But even still, it was often subjected to a fermenting process. It wasn't like they didn't do quick rise bread generally. But if you live near a brewer, you could. But more likely than not, most people just did the wild sourdough thing, right? And you could just take bits of your dough and save it and make the next batch, basically. So the flour in the Middle Ages had the benefit of being freshly ground, right? So it was unlike modern flour where it's ground in a factory and then it gets to us and it will go rancid. Flour in the Middle Ages was ground as needed. So you would send a sack of whole grain to the miller and the miller would send you back a freshly milled sack of flour, and you wouldn't have sacks of pre-milled flour lying about for months and or years. So that means that it actually retained its quality and freshness much, 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 much longer, and it didn't go rancid the way modern flour does. So actually, I think the quality of flour in the Middle Ages was probably way higher than it is now. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah. Chimi's being super cute. He feels it's his mommy time. Okay. So the salt. This is where it gets interesting. So it's the pantler's job to make sure that there is salt on the table and that it's all the good things, that it's finely ground, that it's white, that it's fair, and that it's dry, right? So it's in good condition. Oh, sutilia also means refined in the sense of, I think it also, sutila, I think also means finely ground. So that the salt is finely ground is another implication of the word sutila, right? And then this is what caught my attention, because this is a word I've never seen before in any kitchen context or comestible context. And thy planera for thy salta shala be mada of Iveria. Thy planer, a planer for salt, a salt planer should be made of ivory. A planer, in carpentry, I know what a planer is. I'm assuming that a salt planer must be, you would have a rock salt, and this thing would be used to actually shave off the salt, is what I assume. But I'm assuming, this is conjecture on my part, because I couldn't find any other references to this, and I'm trying to imagine it being made of ivory. So if you have ever seen an extant medieval salt planer, let me know. If you've seen one made of ivory in particular, let me know. I'm really fascinated by this concept. Now I want one for my table. But it's interesting that he says very clearly it should be made of ivory. And this makes complete sense because salt will interact with metal, especially depending on the kind of metal you have. Takeda, can you expound maybe a little bit on the deleterious effects that salt could have on various kinds of metal alloys that may have been used for, say, graters in the Middle Ages? Yeah. So I think that they want it to be made of ivory might have to do with the innocuous is not the word, the non-reactive nature of ivory with salt, I suspect. So lots of conjecture here, but this one really caught my attention, this salt planer. And yes, thank you, Susan, for reminding everyone. Please hit the like and subscribe. And if you just double tap the screen, if you're on a mobile device, that will hit the like button. Yeah. So yeah, this is interesting, an ivory salt planer. Now, if you look up salt planer now, I did, of course, and apparently this is something used in deep sea fishing. It weighs down the fishing line. That's not what this is. This has nothing to do with fishing, and especially not line fishing, because in the Middle Ages, angling was, I don't think it was yet a sport. I don't think it becomes a sport until the 16th century, really. And before that, fishermen are fishing with nets. So, yeah. Okay. Any questions about the salt planer or salt? Someone was asking about Himalayan salt. Obviously, they're talking about white salt. Definitely not pink salt from the Himalayas here. And salt could be made in a variety of ways, or could come from a variety of sources, I should say. Good quality salt was mined from salt mines, right? And apparently the white salt is particularly desirable. I mean, that makes sense. White has implications of purity and cleanliness and whatnot. And medieval people were all about things being clean and pure. How often is the word fera and kleina and meta used here to refer to everything being proper? You could also get marsh salt, which if you lived in like an area with brackish water, so, salt and fresh water mixed, then they would actually evaporate the salt in salt pans. That would give you a really kind of nasty gray salt. And that was used generally for cleaning equipment and for practical utilitarian purposes. And then, of course, there was sea salt depending on where you lived. Okay, Takeda, thank you for filling us in. As he says regarding salt and its interactions with metals, salt helps oxygen react with other things. It is a catalyst. Iron, copper, silver, etc. will all corrode very quickly. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought when I read this, that ivory, you want ivory because it's non-reactive. That's the word, non-reactive with salt, I think. Yeah. So yeah, the planer should be made of ivory, and it actually gives dimensions, which is fascinating. It gives dimensions for this ivory salt planer. It says it should be 2 inches by 3 inches, so 2 inches wide by 3 inches long. So not very big, actually, like about that big. It's actually pretty small. I mean, inches weren't quite exactly the same as they are now, but they were commensurate. They weren't terrible. 15th century English inches weren't terribly different from modern inches. So yeah. Question, would you want to own Cellini's salt thing? I'm not certain what you mean by Cellini's salt thing, Susan. Alex says, how did you get into this hobby? Alex, I've always been fascinated by how people lived in the past from my earliest days. So living history I'd been looking for a medieval living history club when I found one at the age of 14. So I've always been interested in how people lived in the olden days. It's always been a draw for me. Yeah. Takeda says, have you ever seen the box plane for shaving bonito? Oh, yes, I have. Yeah, I wonder if it's something like that, but made of ivory, right? It could also, yeah, right? That could be it, because salt will actually naturally kind of form into granules when you shave it. So yeah, maybe it's something like that. I just wondered if anyone had actually seen one in a medieval European museum, like if any have survived. There are any artifacts, I've traveled all over Europe, and I've been to museums, great and small, some of the most obscure village museums you can imagine, that often have rare and unusual artifacts, but I do not recall seeing a salt planer. Yeah. Okay, so continuing on the topic of salt, he says, and thy salt cellar lid touch not thy salt by. Very important instructions. So the salt cellar would generally actually be made of metal. And he says that you don't want the salt cellar to touch your salt. And I think that might be so that the salt does not corrode the lid. Actually, I suspect that's what that is about. Takeda commenting on the salt cellar. That made of ivory. I seem to recall seeing one in the Chicago Field Museum archives. Interesting. I'll have to look into that. Thank you for that note, Takeda. Very interesting. I definitely want to see this. See if we can dig up this salt cellar. I'm now on a mission. My new rabbit hole: the elusive 15th century ivory salt cellar. Jesus, the holes down which I wander. Right. So yeah, it says that the salt cellar lid, and I could have brought my salt cellar. I have a replica 15th century salt cellar, but it's the kind that doesn't have a lid. It's purely for service. It's not for storage. Yeah. Make sure that the lid does not touch the salt. Right. So I think that's so that the salt does not corrode the lid, is what I suspect. Takeda says, I think it had quartz or quartzite cutting blades. Oh my God, that is fascinating. Yeah, those would also be non-reactive, right? Wow, that's very interesting. I thought maybe you might have a clue, Takeda. Yeah, I did think that. Okay, so then he says, moving on from the topic of salt, all these little details, though, you think about this, all the details about the bread, the kinds of knives you need, what you do with each of the knives, who gets which caliber of bread, and then the salt. You need to monitor the quality of the salt, how finely ground it is. You need to make sure that there's a salt planer supplied, made of ivory, possibly with quartz or quartzite blades, as Takeda said. And that the lid of your salt cellar does not actually touch the salt, right? All these little nitty gritty details. Mathieu, lovely to see you again. Bienvenue. So, moving on, he says, good son, look that thy napery be soot and also fair and clean. Okay, so good son, look that your napery be sweet smelling and also in good condition and clean. So sutta means sweet smelling. Sweet, you can see the sweet and sutta, how those are related etymologically. And fera in this era means in good condition as often as not when you're talking about objects, that it's in good condition and that it's clean. Right. So there's a lot of emphasis on cleanliness, on things being in a good state of repair. Right. This modern misconception of the Middle Ages as being dilapidated and crumbly and fetid and rotten and dirty. Like none of that is borne out by the textual sources. None of it. Right. And then he says, under the category of napery. So napery, for those who don't know, the napkin, same root. Napery is all of the cloth related to dining. So we're talking about, and he lists it off. Here it is. Here's the napery to which he's referring. Make sure that the following napery is sweet smelling, in good condition, and clean. The bordcloth, towel, and napkin, folden alla bedene. So the boardcloth is the 15th century English word for tablecloth. So if you'd like to add some 15th century English to your medieval living history event, call it a boardcloth instead of a tablecloth. You're welcome. So a boardcloth, a towel, and a napkin. Everything folded nicely, folded. So folded in this case can also mean laid out. So folden, to fold in 15th century English doesn't just have the meaning of literally folding things. It also has the meaning of laying it out properly. So make sure that everything is laid out properly, right? Your boardcloth, towel, and napkin all laid out properly. Unfortunately, he doesn't say what laid out properly is. Obviously, the person who is reading this already has seen a properly laid out table, right? It's just like medieval cooking recipes. They assume that you are a contemporary. They don't assume they're a descendant 600 years in the future. They assume you're a contemporary, and that you have, in the case of recipes, eaten this dish, or seen it at least. In the case of instructions for a properly laid table, that you have certainly seen a properly laid table, right? So obviously this isn't as in-depth as it maybe we would like for our modern perspective. But for that, we can then turn to iconography from the era and see how tables laid out in 15th century visual imagery. Yes, imagery is visual. In 15th century imagery, how those tables are laid out. So then we can combine this idea of sweet smelling and fair and clean tablecloth, towel, and napkin, and laid out, and take those written instructions and then use the picture to fill it in. Now, I'd like to point out that sutta, sweet smelling, so these items were often napery, was often stored in a linen closet, and they were stored layered with sweet smelling herbs. And there's a specific combination of herbs that's recommended here, but they were all sweet smelling. And not only did they make the things smell sweet, including lavender, by the way, they also repelled insects. Right, so they helped keep the things clean and in good repair, but also made them smell sweet. So again, once again, more evidence of how important it was to 15th century people for things to be well cared for, in a good state of repair, clean, and that things smelled nice, right? Medieval people didn't like foul smelling things either. So the myth of the Middle Ages being stinky and medieval people just accepting them, no. Would I want Cellini's salt cellar? I really don't know. Are you talking about, is Cellini's salt cellar one of the ones that's in the collection of the Duke of Burgundy, that salt cellar? In which case, yes. Yes, of course I would. Who wouldn't want that beautiful work of goldsmithing? Yeah. Okay. So from the napery, he goes on and he says, Brichte I polished your table knife, semeli in sichte tesena. So make sure that your knives are polished brightly. The knives on the table are polished brightly, and that they are seemly to be seen, right? So that they look nice. So medieval people knew how to take care of their knives. Modern people don't. Modern people think stainless steel equals stainless. Stainless steel, as one of my very clever and witty courtiers once said in the live stream, stainless means it stains less frequently than mild steel. Even stainless steel needs to be dried and cared for properly. But in the Middle Ages, they didn't have stainless steel. So you definitely needed to clean your knives immediately, and then dry them, and then oil them so that they would stay nice and bright, right? So, and polished, right? Bright, bricht I polished, brightly polished, right? Make sure that your table knives are brightly polished. Yeah. Okay, comments. Takeda says, and now I'm looking at where to source good quality faux ivory slabs to figure out how to recreate what I saw. Maybe bone could some kind of bone work in lieu of ivory? Um, I don't know, the bone from a cow bone can be pretty big, for example. Maybe if you polish up cow bone, for instance, might be a good replacement for ivory. Yeah, that would be pretty cool, Takeda. I would so pay you to make me one of these salts, these conjectural salt planers, 100%. 100%. Okay, and I can guarantee you that were you to start making them, we could sell them. I'm confident that once you've reproduced these, there will be many fine nobles in the courts of these lands these days who would very much like to have an ivory salt planer for their tables. Who wouldn't want that beautiful accessory, right? Especially if it's made with quartzite blades. Super awesome. Fantastic. Okay, so moving on. And thy sponus fera I washa, ye wot wela what I mean. And make sure that the spoons are washed well. You know well what I mean. So again, I almost feel like there's a little bit of shaming here, that perhaps this father has had words with his son before about spoons not being clean enough. And he's reminding him, you know what I mean. We've had this conversation before. But what's interesting to note, that's it. That's it on the laying out of the table. We've got bread trenchers, we've got salt, we've got napery, we've got knives, and we've got spoons. What implement is missing from this table? What implement is missing that modern people would expect to be on a table? Yeah, I'll give the comments a moment to catch up. But I'm confident some of you have noticed no forks, right? And this is what I mean when people come at me with, well, there's a mention of forks being used in 12th century Byzantium, Constantinople. Okay, but 12th century Constantinople is not 15th century England. And you should never assume that because some people in a city on the other side of Europe in the 12th century were doing one thing means that continues all the way up to the 15th century, even in Constantinople, or that's a practice that ever made it to England in the Middle Ages. It doesn't seem to have. I have no evidence of forks being used for eating in medieval Western Europe. None. Meat forks are used for cutting, for carving. They're used for serving. Flesh hooks are used for fetching lumps of meat out of a pot. Forks are not used. You will never see them on a table. You will never see them mentioned in these books of etiquette. These books of etiquette will tell you what people actually use to do various things at the table. They never mention forks. They also never mention what some people call the pricker. And again, I'm wishing I brought my medieval eating set with me. They also never mention what people call the pricker, right? The awl that comes, that is often found with medieval knives in the sheath. It's an awl. It is a multi-tool. You can use it to hone the knife blade for a quick hone, to put a quick edge on it, to clean the edge up a little bit. You can use that thing to poke holes in any kind of number of garments or leather or belts. It's great for getting knots out of things. It is not used for food. I have never seen any documentation of it being used for food. Now, someone said that pricker, that awl, that they thought you would use it to hold the meat down and cut it. But that's why you have a meat fork for carving. Food came to the table pre-cut in the size it should be. You didn't have to cut it, because the instructions that come later on for the size in which to serve every single kind of meat and fish tells you that it should be cut in a size that it's already manageable. You do not need to cut it at the table. It's already cut. It's been carved by the carver for you. Yeah, and meat forks had two prongs, and like this long. You do not want to eat from a carving fork. It's a bad plan. Basically, medieval carving forks looked exactly almost like modern carving forks, not really very different. Yeah. Ashley, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Richard, a teaspoon. Oh, very funny. Or maybe you're being serious. I'm sorry. Were you being tongue in cheek? Tea does not get to Europe until the 17th century. And what's fascinating about that is at first it's rejected. It's treated like some kind of weird novelty drink. And at first, it only comes to Europe because the Dutch start importing this Ming Dynasty china, right? And the things that they're importing are teacups and teapots. So they sell it in conjunction with a tea set as a novelty thing that you can use for this beautiful Ming Dynasty porcelain. That's how tea comes into Europe at first. People aren't convinced at first, and then they get convinced real fast. Anirudh says, hello, I'm new here. Your background looks lovely. Thank you. This is a copy of La Dame à la Licorne tapestry that is found in the Cluny. This is an allegory for the sight or the sense of hearing, ouïr, because the lady is playing an organ, a portative organ. Yeah. Oh, thank you for that compliment. Good. I'm glad. I thought you were playing, Richard. Sorry, I couldn't. I thought you were, and I was like, oh, but maybe he wasn't. So I didn't want to mock you or laugh with you if you were being serious. So I just wanted to make sure. I assumed you were playing. I really did, but then I wanted to make certain that I wasn't making bad assumptions. Yeah, a teaspoon, definitely not there. Takeda. So bone would have to be stabilized. Is that something that is easy to do, or not really? Is that a pretty complicated process? Yeah, Ashley, I appreciate you joining my community. And yeah, Anirudh, welcome. Thank you for joining what I'm rapidly calling my court. The Contessa's community must be a court after all. Okay, so spoons, knives, napery, everything clean, everything bright, everything fair, everything subtile, right? Everything in its proper place. A well-ordered dining experience. So definitely not what your average person imagines when they imagine a medieval table, right? The average person is going to imagine food scraps everywhere, no tablecloths, and if there are tablecloths, they're disgusting and dirty, food tossed on the ground, people with grease and juice all over their face and fingers and on wiping their hands on their clothes, right? Knives that are probably dull and rusty. None of that is true. None of it is true anywhere whose culture I've studied in medieval Europe. Okay, moving on. Now we get to the wine barrels. And this was fascinating to me because I'll be honest, I know nothing. Before I read this, I knew nothing about tapping a wine barrel. But I've learned so much from this 15th century set of instructions. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, before we get to it though, my knowledge of history is pretty well established. I can go back as far as the Olmecs and more. Oh yeah, Olmec culture is really fascinating. No, Richard, I was pretty certain you knew, but then I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, I just really wanted to make sure. Takeda. Bone stabilization is an involved process, heating in either a vacuum chamber or a pressure chamber. And I don't have the stuff to do it. Interesting, but they did carve things out of bone in the Middle Ages, not just out of ivory. So I wonder how they did it, because they definitely didn't have vacuum chambers or pressure chambers. Interesting. Or did they just age it? Is that how they stabilized it? What were the wine goblets for the table? Goblets. Yeah, good. Thank you, Susan. Everyone imagines when they imagine a medieval table, they imagine everyone with goblets, right? And goblets are actually not very common. Most often, the kind of when you see glassware being extremely luxury item in this era, by the way. When you see glassware, it's a glass beaker, no stem, kind of shaped like an inverted funnel, maybe a little bit, right? Again, if I really loved you all, I would have brought some of my medieval tableware to show you, but apparently I have failed this medieval story time. Next medieval story time, I will bring medieval tableware to show to you, I promise. Okay, so yeah, goblets are used in communion. Obviously, they're used in church rituals all the time. Goblets as a standard drinking vessel of secular drinking vessel. Civilian, you can tell I'm from a military background. From a secular setting, there is some evidence of some glass stemmed goblets cropping up in the 15th century, but they're an extreme luxury item, and they're not very common. It's more common to have a stemless beaker for wine. What some people have looked at 14th and 15th century depictions of these cups, and they call them red solo cups because they're filled with wine. So the artist paints them as being red because they have wine in them, and they're kind of shaped like a solo cup. No, medieval people did not have red solo cups. They had glassware that was filled with red wine, but it's sort of the same shape-ish as a solo cup. Yeah. Okay. Question. So Mr. Toad says you just need to boil it. Boil the bones. Mathieu says boil the bones to remove all the meat, then go in the oven, maybe 350 degrees for 25 minutes minimum. Interesting. Or seal it after boiling. Just Some Cyborg says, how do you know so much about this era, college or self-studies? Both. My university degree, I'm a linguist by trade, professional translator before AI eat my career. And I lived and studied at 3 European universities also, in addition to my American university studies. And my education was very broad-based. So it was very much focused on a well-rounded education involving history and culture and arts and all of that. But I've also just been an avid self-study person my whole life. I love learning. I love reading. I love reading primary sources. I love reading research papers. So yeah, both a combination of my university training, my undergraduate training, plus continued lifelong learning. And travel. I travel a lot. That's why I have a Travels with the Creative Contessa channel. And whenever I travel, I go to all the museums and learn about the local history and archaeology. Yeah, it's part of one of the main reasons I travel is for that. Yeah. Takeda says, oh, that would be a good short video, a single piece setting as close as you can create what is described here. Yeah, I'll be attending an event where I'll have a proper setting for that. So I'll really be able to do that. I'll keep that in mind. How did glass making work back then? They blew glass. So glass was blown. Well, yeah, blown. It could be molded too. But it basically you take sand and you melt it in a furnace that's really, really, really hot, and you have a long pipe and you blow it and shape it when it's molten. So it's not blown glass in the Middle Ages is not very different from blown glass now. In fact, the techniques haven't changed much. Now we have furnaces that are, either fueled by propane or electricity. Back then they were not. They had to be, fueled by fire, coal. But yeah, basically it's the same technique now. Reading is my favorite hobby besides hiking. Oh, and of course, traveling is the best. Yeah, Ashley, absolutely. Traveling is it's just so fascinating to see how other people live now, have lived in the past, how they think, what they eat, how they interact. Yeah, so if you're interested in following my travels with the Creative Contessa, I'm going to be going on a 14-day Mediterranean cruise coming up, and I'll be exploring all the museums and whatnot there. I'll be doing a lot of live streaming. Yeah, so lots of good stuff coming up. Okay, let me see if I missed anything. Oh, does tartar grow in barrels? I believe so. Tartaric acid. Yeah, tartaric acid is a byproduct of venting, of winemaking. It does. When you empty the barrel out, as I understand it, I think it's when you empty the barrel, once the barrel is empty, then there's the residue that's left behind is tartaric acid, cream of tartar, right? I think it is. But yeah, it is a byproduct of venting, of winemaking. The oven trick is for drying it and sterilizing at a high temperature, but working with bone could be dangerous if you breathe the bone dust, especially if it hasn't been in an oven. Oh, interesting. Good to know, Mathieu. Thank you for sharing that. Takeda says, related table things item and related to the end of the stream last night, Todd Cutler just released new 14th and 15th century table knives this weekend. Ooh, nice. Todd Cutler, not a channel sponsor. I don't care. We've bought a lot of cutlery from him. His products are super high quality, and other cast items, including my wonderful travel candlesticks from the 15th century. Yeah, so check out Todd Cutler's site. If you do order from him, just casually mention that you heard about him through me. If you did, it might be interesting for him. I might hit him up for channel sponsorship. Anyway, okay, moving on to the wine barrels and how to tap them. This was fascinating, and I'm not even certain I fully understood all of the nuances. So if there's anyone there who is an expert on wine barrels and tapping into wine barrels, chime in as we go along. Okay, so he says, look, thou have attires too. Amora and lassa for vina. Look that you make sure that you have two terrors, Tarrers. This is apparently the 15th century English word for an auger, for a wine auger. You have two of them, a bigger one and a smaller one for the wine. Then he says, Wina canas according to the taras of box fetissa and fina. So you should have wine taps made of boxwood that is refined and in good shape, right? And that it should match with the size of the terrors that you have, of the augurs that you have. Now, what I understand is that the barrels are sealed and that you actually need to drill into the barrels and that you use the tarer, the augur, to drill into the barrel. That's what I, having read up on it, that's what I understand. If I am wrong, there are actual experts out there, let me know. So, and you also need box taps, taps made of boxwood, and that they should match the size of your augurs, basically, is what this seems to say, according to the tares, right? And then he says, you should also have a gimlet sharpa, a sharp gimlet. You should have a sharp gimlet. So, and it says a gimlet sharpa to brocha and persa sona to torna and twina. So this is a gimlet that's used for breaching and piercing the barrel, right? So that's apparently what I understand is you use the gimlet to make the first piercing, and it basically creates a small hole. Now, again, if I misunderstood this, let me know. What I understood from my reading about this process, the gimlet would have been used to make an initial hole, and it's designed specifically so that it makes a hole without causing the wood to break or shatter, right? So you want to make sure that this process is carefully done and that there's no trauma rendered unto the wood of the barrel, because you don't want it to break and shatter and end up with wood splinters in your wine, right? Okay, and then you will also have faucet and tampina ready to stop when they setima. So you have a pipe, a faucet, the pipe, and the bung, the tampina, is apparently one of the 15th century English words for bung. You should have them ready to stop things when it's time, right? So when thou settest a pipa a brocha, good sona, do after my lora. Forefinger over the nera tina, thou may persa or bora. So when you are going to broach the pipe, he says, follow my instructions. Do after my lora, right? With the terror or the gimlet, pierce upward the pipe ashore. So basically go 4 fingers over, four fingers over the near chena, how many pierce or bora. So basically, you're going to broach the pipe, you're going to pierce it with this augur or gimlet, 4 fingers breadth over the lower rim, and he says, so shala the not causa the lias up turiza iwarna yao evermora, so that you don't cause the dregs to rise, right? So this is a technique to make it so that the dregs do not rise and mix into the wine, right? So the level of details here that he actually gives, I can't even get medieval recipes to give me measurements for cooking, but here we've got the dimensions of an ivory salt planer, and then over here we've got the dimensions that you need 4 fingers width. Is the point where you should drill above the lower rim. So if you imagine the barrel, right? You imagine the barrel, the lower rim, right? And you're going to measure, this is the lower rim, you take your fingers and you take 4 fingers and you measure up, and this is where you bore the hole for the bung, for the faucet. What do they call it? Yeah, the faucet, right? That was the word for the faucet, so that you don't cause the dregs to rise up and get mixed into the wine. Right. Yeah. It's just the details on this were really Tadir. Oh, interesting, Mathieu. I didn't have a chance to look at the etymology. Of course it's a French word. Tarière. Of course it is. Right. Brilliant. Yeah, so tara. Yeah, this is late Middle English, early modern English, depending on how you're looking at it. 15th century English in any case. Yeah, Tarrers. No doubt. No doubt that is the word that is taken from the French. 100%. The tara. And yeah, that would totally make sense. Tarière. Of course. Thank you, Mathieu. I did not know that was the French word. Makes total sense. Yep. Oh, thank you, Brooke. Appreciate the compliment as always. It's amazing how much they knew about alcohol making, given that they knew so little about bacteria. So, it's funny. You're right. They didn't necessarily, they didn't understand germ theory in the sense of they did not necessarily have the understand that of these microscopic creatures that that can cause disease in the wrong quantities and of the wrong type. But they did have an understanding of cause and effect and scientific observation of cause and effect over time. So, for instance, they knew that if they submerged things in boiling water, whether it's equipment or food items like meat, that the outcomes were way better, that people didn't get poisoning and die of horrible stomach maladies or the dropsy, right? They understood that. So even though they didn't know exactly what bacteria were, they understood that there was something that was handled by, say, applying heat or applying UV light, sunlight. Even though they didn't know what ultraviolet light was, they understood that sunlight also helped purify things, helped make them, what is the word? Helped make them fairer, right? Helped make them fairer and cleaner, right? So they understood cause and effect, even if they didn't understand about the microbiota themselves. Yeah. But it is interesting how correct medieval people were about the way of doing things to preserve life, um, even if they didn't fully understand the science that underpinned it. Yeah, it is really interesting. So yeah, that's it. That's the first set of the jobs of the pantler and butler, but it goes on quite a bit, and I think we'll pick up next time talking about all of the different foods. There's a whole listing of fruit and things that need to be laid out. And that are the job of the pantler and the butler to make sure that they are placed out. So it's not just the wine and the bread. There's also a whole bunch of other things that aren't necessarily the purview of the cook, for instance, or the pastry maker, but that fall under the heading of the butler and the pantler as part of the preparation for the meal. So if you all are interested in continuing with discovering what goes on a feast table or a dinner table in the Middle Ages, just let me know, but I think we will continue with that next time. I'd like to get on to some of our other selections for the day. And in fact, this is going to segue us nicely into Margaret of York's wedding feast in Bruges. So are there any questions about today's reading from the Book of Nurture, about the roles of the butler and the pantler, of how many knives you have, what the knives are used for your bread, of salt and how it should be prepared, your table, your utensils like your knives and your spoons. And now we have this detailed set of instructions on the equipment that the butler would need, and also what to do with that equipment. And I think what was most interesting to me is I didn't think about it. Of course, they don't have wine in bottles. Wine comes in barrels in this era, which means one of the most important jobs for the bouteiller, the bouteiller, is to get the wine out of the barrel. And that's not as easy as just unscrewing a lid, right? I mean, if I had actually intellectualized the process, I would have realized that. But I never really thought about it in depth before now, because I'm not a big wine drinker. So it's, I didn't really think about how the wine gets from the vineyard to the table. And of course, it's shipped in barrels. And that means that the butler has to know how to access that barrel in such a way that minimum oxygen is introduced, right? And so that the sediment isn't raised up, and so that you don't end up with splinters in your wine. So yeah, there's a reason that there's this detailed set of instructions and equipment, sophisticated equipment, that the butler will need to not only have, but will have to know how to use. And so the role of butler, as I mentioned, was often occupied by a nobleman. It was not always occupied by some middle-class schmo. So this means this is part of being a nobleman in a noble household, is understanding how to do all of these things. Yeah. Oh, Leah, welcome to my reading live stream. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, learning about historic foods and cuisine and theory just feels so fulfilling. If you're interested in historic foods, 2 nights ago, I did a medieval cooking party. Well, 2 nights ago, my time. So 36 hours ago, 36 hours ago, I did a live stream medieval cooking party where we recreated 2 medieval recipes. If you want to check that out, highly recommend. The recording is definitely on YouTube. Yeah, okay, so let us move on then to the wedding feast of Margaret of York. Yeah, so the reading I'm taking from a book that is available through interlibrary loan. It's available commercially as well, but it's going to be expensive. So I recommend interlibrary loan. Court and Civic Society in the Burgundian Low Countries. As always, after the book reading, I will take pictures of the front and the back of the book with the ISBN, and I'll publish them in all my various post walls: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Right, so you can see, and if you want to actually obtain the books by hook or by crook, you can. Interlibrary loan might be the best way for this one, though, because it is not an inexpensive book. So this is a collection of primary source chronicles that elucidate and illuminate life in the 15th, mostly 15th century Burgundian court, a little bit in the early 16th century, but not too much. So there's a collection of chroniclers in here that are famous for those of us who are 15th century geeks. So we have Olivier de la Marche. A lot of his memoirs are contained in this text. And then there's some other lesser known chroniclers as well who are in here. So today's reading is actually brought to us by Olivier de la Marche's account of the wedding of Margaret of York and Charles the Duke of Burgundy. Here, Jimmy, come in my lap. If you're gonna, okay, here you go. There's a good baby. Yeah, here we go. I don't know, can you all see? I've got a lap kitty. Yeah. Okay, so let me go ahead and give you a little bit of the background of this wedding. So first off, Margaret of York is of the House of York. She is Edward IV's sister. So this marriage is supposed to have united England and Burgundy in the 15th century. It should have guaranteed that France never came to pass, honestly, that France as a kingdom just sort of remained relatively obscure and Burgundy became a kingdom in and of its own right. That is what was supposed to have happened. Edward ended up being pretty perfidious and not going through with that, and actually putting his sister in a pretty awkward position, in fact. Asshole. Anyway, no judgment. So in 1468, in the summer of 1468, is the marriage of this union between Margaret of York and Charles the Bold. And Margaret is his third wife. He has had terrible luck with wives. They keep dying. And he's had not managed to sire a single son. Just one daughter, Mary of Burgundy. As we know now, it's his fault that he couldn't have a son, because it's on him. He's the only one who can decide it's his biology that determines whether it's a boy or a girl. And he never manages to sire a son, which is why we talk about France, the country of France, and not the country of Burgundy. I think if he'd actually sired a son, we might these days talk about Burgundy and not France. But anyway, that's a discussion, an alternate history discussion for another time. So they get married actually on the 3rd of July in Damme, which is about 3 miles from Bruges. But the biggest ceremony is actually in Bruges itself. And at the time, in the money of the era, it cost £60,000. But that may or may not actually include all the costs. And if you adjust for inflation, 15th century, £60,000 to modern currency, it's an obscene amount of money. right? So let us go ahead and commence with the festivities. So we now find ourselves in Margaret, Lady Margaret, as she's referred to in the chronicle, is leaving Dama and processing to Bruges. She's making a progress to Bruges. So we're talking July 3rd, July 4th. So it's warm, by the way. By all accounts, this is a warm summer. It is not a cold little ice age summer. It's a warm summer. I'd like you to keep that in mind. Lady Margaret processed with her ladies from Dama to the gate of Bruges called the Holy Cross Gate, and in view of a great number of princes, knights, and esquires, noblemen, and nations who met the lady that day, richly dressed and in fine order. I pass over this to be brief because I want to come to the order in which they entered the town. Of course, hierarchy is very important. But first, I'm obliged to call to mind a noble knight from Zeeland who, at that moment and entry, had 6 horses covered in outfits of cloth of gold, brocaded with metal threads of very costly silk cloth and ornamental covering. He was called Adrian von Borselen, Lord of Breda, whom I recall in this account for 2 reasons. First, because he was the best turned out in this entry. The second, because, by the will of God, he died the following Wednesday through an infected leg. His death was a shame and was greatly regretted by the nobility. So, yeah, this is a very interesting start to this account. First off, the idea that what matters is the order in which people entered the city. But then he makes this side note and says, but also I want to give props to this one person whom I judge to be the winner of the best dressed. You know, nothing has changed. If you watch the Oscars, if you've watched the Met Gala, right, there's always some damn commentator, Olivier Delamarche, who is making snarky comments and, you know, deciding about who's the best and worst dressed. And so he specifically says that Adrian von Borselen definitely qualifies at this entry, this gala, as being the best dressed because he has 6 horses covered in cloth, basically barding of cloth of gold with actual gold threads, right? Brocaded with gold threads, very costly silk and ornamental covering. So, you know, just want you to imagine cloth of gold is often gold and sometimes mixed with velvet, but this might just be pure cloth of gold. So it's silk and gold threads. And this is the middle of the day and it's going to shine in the sunlight. It will be very impressive to see. But then he says the second reason is because he dies the following Wednesday through an infected leg, which probably means he had a jousting accident. I'm going to bet we find out he had a jousting accident. And this underscores the reason why I don't want to actually travel back to a pre-antibiotic era. People always ask me, if you could travel back to any era, to which era would you like to travel? And my answer is always, do I have to travel back? Can I just look through a safety glass window into the past instead? Because he dies of an infected leg. Like this is a knight, a puissant knight. He's wealthy, he's got means, and yet some probably minor incident causes an infection that causes septicemia and he dies. So that's actually how most knights died in the Middle Ages. If they died in battle, they didn't die in battle. Mostly they died of their wounds from infection days later. It was not a glorious death. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. So, moving on. Let me see. I will get to some of these questions afterwards. Anirudh, hope to see you later. Thank you for joining. Welcome to my community. Okay, yeah, wonder what Joan Rivers would say. Yeah, yep. Okay, so we have Lady Margaret progressing. Lady Margaret, the Duchess, my lady, the Duchess, Madame la Grande, progressing from Dam to Bruges, right? So they lined up at the Holy Cross Gate, and those who accompanied our noble Lady Duchess processed in the following manner, which I relate, omitting nothing. And then he goes on into this very long list of everyone who was in this order. And I'm definitely going to skip over this because it's not particularly the most interesting part of this. I want to get to the feasting. Let me just say that there are a lot of people in this procession, a lot of people, hundreds of people in this procession, and that they're actually marching 2 by 2. So this is one hell of a progress. If you've ever done any kind of reenactment of a medieval procession, I know that there aren't enough people at most medievalist events to even make up the procession, let alone the procession plus spectators that this would entail. Okay, so skipping forward, right, okay. So now we're going to get into some of the ambassadors, right? The ambassadors, as many prelates as knights, came after the company of ladies, each taking the rank of his master. And the Chancellor of Burgundy and the Council of the Household were organized to accompany them. There were the bishops of Salisbury, Metz, Verdun, Cambrai, Utrecht, Tournai, the Knight of the King of Aragon, 3 or 4 knights, clerics, and gentlemen of the Count Palatine, that's the Pfalz, for those of you who understand German, and many others whose names I cannot remember. And then after them came the nations in order who processed in the following manner. So here we're going to get an idea of just how international the court of Burgundy was. The Venetians came first. They and their servants on horse, the masters all dressed in crimson velvet, and the valets in vermilion cloth. In front of them, there were 50 men on foot dressed in vermilion, each with a torch in his hand. Then came the Florentines, who had 60 torches carried by 60 men on foot dressed in blue. And after the torches came 4 pages, one after the other, who had doublets of cloth of silver and capes of crimson velvet, mounted on 4 chargers, which were covered in white satin, bordered with blue velvet. Behind the Florentine merchants came Tommaso Portinari by name, head of their nation, dressed like the counselors of the Duke, for he was in his council. And after him came 10 merchants, 2 by 2, dressed in decorated black satin. And after them came 10 factors, dressed in simple black satin. All had crimson doublets. After them came 24 valets on horseback, all dressed in blue. Then came the Spaniards, who were 34 merchants on horseback, dressed in violet damask, and each merchant had his page on foot in front of him, dressed all the same in doublets of black satin and jackets of crimson velvet. They had 60 torches carried by 60 men in front of them, dressed in violet and green. The Genoese came after them, with a beautiful girl on horseback in front of them, representing the Virgin, the king's daughter, whom St. George had saved from the dragon. And then came St. George, armed with all sorts of weapons, his horse covered in white damask, and a cross of crimson velvet. And the girl was dressed in white damask. After this pageant, 3 pages followed, dressed in white damask, and their horses in violet damask. Afterward came the Genoese merchants, 108 of them, all dressed in violet cloth. And after them came the Germans, 108 on horse, dressed in violet robes, and several in gray fur. And there were 6 pages dressed in violet satin and robes of white damask, their horses covered with violet damask, and in front of them were 60 torches, and men carrying them also dressed in violet. So you can imagine this amazing procession. Yeah, right, Takeda? Wow, what a lot of very, very, very expensive fabrics. Yes, and so many people, each of these contingents, right? The Venetians, dressed in crimson velvet, and their valets in vermilion cloth. This is going to be probably doeskin wool, like red doeskin wool. And then 50 men on foot. Everyone kept bearing torches. So you can imagine how many torches there were in this procession. It's amazing that Bruges didn't go up in flames that day, I'll be honest. And then the Florentines, and I love this name drop. Tommaso Portinari, right? The famous Tommaso Portinari of the Hugo van der Goes altarpiece in the Uffizi, his wife Maria Baroncelli, nee Baroncelli, Maria Portinari, with her famous collar, right? And what's interesting is it mentions specifically that Thomas is dressed like the counselors of the Duke, for he is on the Duke's council. So here's a merchant who is on the Duke's council. So one of the things the Dukes of Burgundy were better at, I would say, than many other of their peers, their contemporary leaders, they were good at recognizing talent beyond the aristocracy. They didn't just go for aristocrats when it came to appointing people to positions of leadership power. Charles the Bold Philip the Good started this trend, and his son continued it, of recognizing talent regardless of place of birth. And so here we have, yes, I know Tommaso was a representative of the Medici, but he was still a freaking plebe, right? He was still a plebe. He was not of the blood, as it were. And yet Charles the Bold has appointed Tommaso to be on his council, which means that Maria Portinari is soon going to be introduced to Margaret, guarantee you. And even though most of the records of Margaret's household went down in flames because of those fuckers in the French Revolution. Yes, I dropped an F-bomb. That is how I feel about the French revolutionaries who purposefully set fire to the archives because they viewed them as holding the record of their oppression. Fuck you, destroying history because you're a bunch of pissant fucking peasants. Sorry, I'll pull it back. I apologize for all those F-bombs. I get really upset when I think about all the history that was purposefully set aflame at the end of the 18th century in France. And within the fire, because they set fire to the archives in Dijon and the archives in that are now in Flanders, that are now in Belgium. But yeah, in those archives were a lot of the records of Margaret of York's household. So I don't have proof positive that Maria Portinari was in her household, but it would be frankly shocking to me had she not been incorporated into her household, and that beautiful collar she's wearing may have been a gift from Margaret to her, actually. Yeah. Okay, so we've got name drop on Tommaso Portinari, and the thing that's really interesting to me about all of these clothes is how so many people are in exactly matching ensembles. So it would have been colorful, but also it wouldn't have been jarring. It would have been stunning, it would have been captivating, and it's very carefully coordinated. You've got 60 people all wearing exactly the same thing, same fabric, same colors. So it would have been livery in the way that most modern people think of livery. Matching garments made of matching fabrics so that everyone looks standard and uniform. And so many people, so very many people, but the way it's described, the way different terms are described for different garments also tells us that it's not the same exact style from the Venetians to the Florentines to the Genoese, right? I'd also like to make a shout out for 15th century cosplay. 15th century cosplay is 100% mentioned here. Did you pick up on that? The mention of, I was kind of trying to join in. Sorry, Nevis. Sorry, Nevis. I've got really strong feelings about people who purposely set fires to libraries and archives. Real strong feelings. Especially for pissant reasons. It's like, they oppressed us for hundreds of years. We're going to burn all records of it. Well, that's not how you learn from history. That's how you make sure that you're going to get oppressed again, assholes. Anyway, apologies. You know, that's not my usual tone. That's not how I speak on a regular basis. But I do feel passionate about the archives being set on fire that contained all the records for Margaret of York's household. Right. Okay, so the cosplay, back to the 15th century cosplay. So we have here this mention of St. George. So the Genoese come, and in front of them, so leading this, the Genoese procession is a beautiful woman on horseback, representing the Virgin, the king's daughter, whom St. George saved from the dragon. And also along with her comes St. George, armed with all sorts of weapons. His horse is covered in white silk damask and with a cross of crimson velvet, which is going to be silk velvet, by the way. And the girl is also in white damask. So The gall to put white silk damask on your horse. That is a baller move. Horses poop all the time. And I guarantee you that the beautiful green of horse manure ended up staining permanently, possibly, this white silk damask. That is such conspicuous consumption in the 15th century. To use white silk damask for a procession outside on a horse. Amazing. Wow. That is a move. That's a power move. That was absolutely recognized even at the time as a power move. But I love the idea of this cosplaying, and I can guarantee you that probably the way this young lady was dressed, her dress was allegorical. Possibly something like this, maybe. It was designed so that the viewers would recognize that she was not just an actual contemporary princess. She is the princess from the Legend of St. George and the Dragon, the ancient princess. And so if I were wanting to depict the princess from the Tale of St. George and the Dragon, I would actually now go and look at 15th century art depicting her, see what kind of clothes she's wearing, and I would make those clothes as a 15th century cosplay that would be recognizable to 15th century people as a costume. Right? So this is the context in which you get to wear those really cool, fun clothes that you see in a lot of his art. This is not daily wear, but it is fantasy costume of the 15th century. Yeah. Thinking about this description, the value of what is being worn for this is probably even above what we spent on a big budget blockbuster film. Yeah, probably. Probably. Well, Nevis, I guess it's a good hook, huh? Yeah, Takeda, absolutely. If you look at the cost of the garments that everyone is wearing, definitely more than a big budget blockbuster movie even now, especially if you adjust for inflation and currency effects. Yeah. Yeah, Court and Civic Society in the Burgundian Low Countries is the book that has compiled a bunch of these chronicles from which we're reading. We are just now reading from the chronicle of compiled by Olivier de la Marche, who was present, first-hand account, who was present at the wedding for much of Charles the Bold's reign, actually, and who is present at the wedding of Margaret of York and Charles the Bold. So this is his account of that. And we are just now talking only about the procession for Margaret's grand entry into Bruges. And something I didn't explain is that when a prince, capital P, king, prince, whatever, prince, capital P, or princess, capital P, either assumes the throne or marries into the throne, they have a series of triumphal entries, into the major cities of their realm. And this is what they did before TV. This is what they did before TV. They would go physically to all the major cities and they would enter so that the people could see them, could actually develop a connection with them physically by seeing them, by interacting with them, by seeing them process through the streets, by seeing them dancing in the ball, in the marketplace. Right, so that's what an entry is. And this is Margaret's entry into Bruges. And Bruges is trying to really outdo all the other cities. And they actually succeed. Yep, they definitely actually succeed. They really do. Okay, so continuing on. In such an order and array, my lady entered her city of Bruges. Love it. I must begin by recounting the tableau set up for her joyous entry. The streets were hung very richly with gold and silk cloth and with tapestries. And as for the tableau, I have remembered 10 of them. So before I get to the tableau, I want you to imagine some of you have been to Bruges. Some of you might be from Bruges, maybe, if you're watching from the middle of the night in Europe. I want you to imagine Bruges, the medieval part of Bruges, and I want you to imagine that the buildings from the windows, the second stories of these buildings, they have hung gold and cloth of gold and silk, cloth of gold and silk to cover the entire procession route for Margaret, right? The expense. Oh my God. It's like the most ultra expensive form of bunting you can imagine. And it hangs down probably to the first level windows, I'm going to say. Right. So from the second story windows to the first story windows, cloth of gold and silk alternating all the way down her procession route in Bruges, and tapestries also. So just imagine how magical this must have been. What a setting for a parade, eh? And now we get to the tableau. And so these are indeed tableaux vivants. So these are, or tableaux vivants. So these are sort of like miniature plays. They're pantomimes, usually. And they represent a specific scene of legend or history or the Bible or allegorical. And they're always designed to underscore the power and grace and beauty of the new prince or princess, right? There's propaganda about this. So now we get to the tableau. He remembers 10 of them, he recalls. He says, the first was of God accompanying Adam and Eve in paradise. The second, how Cleopatra was given in marriage to King Alexander. And in this way, the appropriate tableaux were set up as far as the ducal residence. Right. So this underscores that the medieval understanding of history was sometimes about as accurate as the modern understanding of history, right? So obviously Cleopatra was not given in marriage to King Alexander. Because they're talking about Alexander the Great. They are separated by several hundred years. But there was a legend about that at the time. But, you know, the first tableau being God accompanying Adam and Eve in paradise. Well, you know, there's a couple of potential references there, right? You know, the first man, the first woman, Charles and Margaret, the first man, the first woman of Burgundy. And they're still in paradise. So this is before the fall, and God is accompanying them. The idea being that Charles and Margaret are God's appointed representatives on earth, and that he stands with them, right? With his hands on their shoulders practically, so that any of their actions should be interpreted as the work of God, right? As having the support of God. Yep. Sounds like the tabernacle in scripture. Yeah, a little bit. Oh, my condottiero has joined us. Welcome, my condottiero. Right, okay, so in front of the residence, and I think this is the Prinsenhof. I'm pretty certain they're talking about the Prinsenhof here. In front of the residence was a rich tableau painted in gold and azure, in the middle of which were 2 lions rampant, holding a shield with the arms of the Duke of Burgundy. And around the tableau were 12 blazons of arms of the ducal lands, the duchies and the counties. And on top of it, here's the tabernacle. And on top of the tabernacle on one side was St. Andrew, and below it were the flints as devices, and the motto of the Duke, Je l'ai emprunt, I have undertaken it. On either side of the tableau were 2 archers richly painted and in relief. One was a Greek drawing a Turkish bow, and for the duration of the feast, wine from the bone sprang from the end of his arrow. On the other side was a German firing a crossbow, and from the end of his crossbow sprang Rhenish wine. The wine from both fell into large stone vats, which everyone could fill up from and drink at their pleasure. Within the courtyard, toward the spicery, was a large pelican, which pecked at its breast, and instead of the blood that should have come out, there flowed hippocras, which fell into a wicker basket, subtly done so that nothing was lost, but everyone could partake of it at their pleasure. I want this tableau for my next party so much. I really so much want this tableau. So the Prinsenhof is a 15th century palace built down in the center, more or less the center-ish of Bruges. And so I want you to imagine, if you haven't seen, if you don't know what the Prinsenhof looks, the Prinsenhof, I think it's not there anymore, if I recall correctly. It didn't survive to the modern day. If anyone is from Bruges and can confirm that, I have seen 16th century depictions of the Prinsenhof. It was magnificent. So I want you to imagine any kind of Gothic palace from the lowlands, from Flanders in this era, with a big, massive courtyard. And so in that courtyard, in front of the residence, they have this tableau, which is like a combination of painting and sculpture, right? And so you've got sculpted lions rampant, holding shields with the arms of the Duke of Burgundy, which, by the way, if this is probably the full arms, which has all of the quarterings. They're pretty impressive. And then, oh, the divisions rather. And then you've got this tabernacle, so this altar-like thing, which you have St. Andrew on it, and you've got the Duke's flints, which are actually also the symbol of the emblem of the order of the on the chain from which the Order of the Golden Fleece is hung generally. And so you've got these archers, right? One is a Greek drawing a Turkish bow. And from the end of this arrow, they have rigged this up so that it is a wine fountain. You've got an archer drawing a Turkish bow, a sculpture of an archer drawing a Turkish bow, and they've rigged it all up so that wine is flowing from the tip of the arrow. And then you've got a German with a crossbow on the other side, and they've rigged that up so that Rhenish wine from the Rhineland, right? German wine from German wine country is flowing from that side. Rhenish wine is actually known for being very, very, very delicious in this era, right? And they fall into stone vats. And then this is interesting. The imagery here is really fascinating. Within the courtyard toward the spicery is another sculpture, a pelican, which picked at its breasts, and instead of blood, there flowed hippocras. Hippocras is spiced wine. And there's lots of recipes, different recipes for hippocras, but it's generally sweet spices, poudre douce. But what's interesting about the pelican, does anyone know what the pelican symbolizes in medieval mythology, in medieval Christian mythology, right? The pelican is a metaphor for Christ. It's a symbol of Christ, because the myth of the pelican is that the pelican is so self-sacrificing that it will peck out its own heart so that the blood will flow freely from its heart to feed its starving young in times of desperation. It will sacrifice itself for its offspring, for its children, right? And of course, in the communion and the transfiguration, the blood becomes wine, right? Or wine becomes blood, vice versa. So that they have purposely chosen the symbol of Christ, one of the several medieval symbols of Christ, metaphors for Christ, and substituted the blood that should flow with wine is not an accident. So we've got a lot of heavy-handed references to the connections between the ducal couple, the Duke and the Duchess, and their connections to God and to Jesus, right? So yeah, exactly. It's there's some pretty not subtle things here. So that's really interesting. And the fact that hippocras is also sweetened. So it's sweetened and spiced, although it doesn't necessarily have to be sweetened. It could just be a sweet wine that is then spiced. But yeah, that is very, very interesting. Okay, so let us return now to the arrival of that beautiful lady, Our Lady the Duchess. She entered the courtyard around midday. The Duke's mother, Isabel of Portugal, was waiting for her at the entrance of the hall, accompanied by the Duke's wife and my Lady of Argouges, with a good 100 other ladies and damsels of rank. When the litter drew near, the Duke's mother went before it. But soon the yeomen of the crown, who were ordered to do this, took the litter on their shoulders and carried it away from the horses in front of my lady and placed it on the ground. There the litter was uncovered, and the Duke's mother helped the beautiful girl out of the litter, and to the sound of trumpets and clarions, led her by the hand to her bedroom. For the moment, we will keep silent about the ladies and knights and return to describe the organization of the household. Right. So now we get into details that will definitely fit in really nicely with our discussion of the pantler and the butler. But I would like to mention a couple of things here, right? So basically, she's being received by Isabel of Portugal, who is now the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, right? Once again, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy. Well, she's been the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy actually for a little while at this point. Philip the Good dies in 1457, I think. Maybe will be 1463. 1463, maybe. I think 1463. Don't hold me to that though. But he's been dead for a little while, so she's now the Dowager Duchess. She is an Infanta of Portugal. She was a princess of the crown of the Kingdom of Portugal, right? So she's pretty high-ranking herself. And Margaret of York is not a princess herself, right? She is a princess kind of because her brother is the King of England, but she was not born to a king or a queen. Right. So she's a bit of an upstart in that regard. I mean, she's, she's a duke's daughter. She's the daughter of a duke of the royal blood. Right. But she's not of the same rank as Isabella of Portugal at all. She's not the same initial station. Right. But Isabella of Portugal going out and welcoming her and taking her by the hand to lead her into the chamber, is a very visual symbol of, I'm the old guard. This is the new guard. This is my daughter now. She is the new duchess, right? There's all kinds of symbolism here. So let's go to the household of the organization of the household. This is actually interesting. To begin with, the common offices in the kitchen. There were 300 men in the kitchen. In the saucery, 24. In the butler's office and the pantry, 60 men each, and in the spicery, 15. Generally, all the offices were heavily manned. So this is the Duke's household. Just his kitchens have 300 men. The saucery, which their sole job is to make sauces. Remember I've often said medieval kitchens were highly specialized. So separate office, just sauces. This is how important sauces were at the medieval table. 24 sauce makers. The butler's office had 60 men and the pantler's office had 60 men. So in the Duke's household, those are two separate jobs. So one side of that handles the bread and all bread-related things, and the other side handles the wine and all wine-related things. And then in the spicery, 15 people, and the spicery's sole job was to manage spices, procure the spices, make certain that the spices were well stored, and to grind them in the required amounts. So again, highly specialized, highly sophisticated kitchen organization. In the residence, there was a little room set aside in front of the chapel where the Duke alone dined. And next to this room was a large room where all the chamberlains ate. Further on was a bigger room where the chief stewards and the regular men at court ate. And this one was full several times with the great number of gentlemen, archers, pages, officers of arms, trumpeters, minstrels, and other musicians who were there for the feast. So this is actually how this isn't how everything always was laid out. This is them trying to make certain there's space for everyone. Because this feast is definitely meant to be for as many people as possible, to show the power and the wealth and the largesse, the generosity of the Burgundian court, right? So you've got the Duke who dined alone. Interesting, right? The Duke and the Duchess on their wedding feast, one of their several wedding feasts, are not dining together. They're dining separately. The Duke is dining alone. Then next to this was a large room where just the chamberlains ate, right? And then you've got the chief stewards and the regular men at court. And then there's another hall for, and this is an interesting list, gentlemen, so lower gentry, archers, pages, officers of arms, so heralds, trumpeters, minstrels, and musicians are categorized separately. I'm going to bet that minstrels refers to people who sing to music, and that the musicians just play instruments. But all these people were invited to participate in this feast. So the Burgundian court is famous for its music scene. The Burgundian court fostered the greatest musicians of the 15th century, hands down. And so this also shows how much they valued their minstrels and their musicians, that they have given them a place of honor at this wedding feast. Yeah. Okay, questions? Let's see. Oh, thank you, Angel. I appreciate that. Angel, thank you very much. I appreciate that compliment. Oh, goodness. Philip the Good, 1467. Okay, right. It was very close to their wedding. Yep. Thank you for double checking on that. Oh, thank you, Jamon. Appreciate that. Jamon Herman. Okay, so moving on with the feast. Let me see. Where do we pick up? Okay. Moreover, there were several rooms in the house for the entertainment of guests, one of which was occupied by the bastard. That's the natural son of Charles the Good, who is treated just like his Philip the Good. Philip the Good's natural son. It's called the Bastard of Burgundy. It's not a slur. It's an official position at the court. Accompanied by my Lord of La Roche, and in the other rooms were Jacques Saint-Paul, my lords of Arcy and of Gruthusa and of Berg, and several others who were accompanying them. In each room there was a steward, and men ordered to serve them there. To hold a great court, a room was made in a large courtyard, which was called the tennis court. So they're acknowledging that this urban space, this palace in Bruges, is actually not designed for a mass gathering. And so they've adapted it, which those of you who've run medieval events, you know how often we adapt the spaces we have at our disposal to suit the needs, even if it wasn't originally intended for that. So another way in which we medieval living historians are often accidentally authentic. And what's interesting is that to hold a great court, they've taken the tennis court. And here's a reference to the tennis court, right? So apparently it was, there's a description of conserving the tennis court later on. It was a wooden hall. So basically a wooden hall was set up in the tennis court. And this was so that they would have an indoor space. It says, this room had been hastily made, very large, high and spacious with carpentry, so a wooden hall. It was illuminated so well and so perfectly through glass windows that everyone said that it was one of the most beautiful rooms they had seen. How many of you have been to Penzig and seen the wooden structures that people build there that are temporary? Here is evidence of medieval people doing exactly that, building a structure, a giant wooden hall, just for the purposes of this event. But what's so luxurious about this temporary hall that they built? Glazed windows. Glazed windows in the 15th century are an extreme luxury item. Most homes, not even castles, had glazed windows in this era. This is the era when they are slowly being able to glaze the windows of palaces and castles, and that they went to the extra expense and luxury of glazing the windows of a temporary structure built for this wedding feast is remarkable. Conspicuous consumption for the win, right? High up on the room was hung with blue and white woolen cloth, and on its sides were tapestries and hangings showing the story of Jason, by which the beginning of the mystery of the Golden Fleece could be understood. Right, so you've got blue and white woolen cloth for decorative purposes, but between that are sandwiched in tapestries depicting and hangings. Note there's two separate words here. Tapestries and hangings depicting the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. The reason is because tapestry is a woven hanging that where the picture that it's depicting, the imagery is woven into it. Hangings, the depiction is painted on or drawn on. So notice both are mentioned. Both are mentioned, which is why you have the word tapestry is supposed to refer to something that's woven, and a hanging is something where the pattern is painted on. Right, so technically this is a tapestry weave because it is a tapestry weave, but the pattern is actually what painted on top, so it's kind of both weirdly. Right, so Jason and the Golden Fleece. That is a very interesting tale to choose to be a parable for your wedding, right? Because Jason is perfidious in the extreme. He uses Medea, and then when he gets what he wants, he eventually discards her so he can marry a princess, a different princess, right? So that's a choice, but they're focusing on the golden fleece part. So they're focusing on a man using a woman to get what he wants. Anyway, I'm confident that's not how they viewed it. The tapestry was completely made of gold, silver, and silk. So imagine how this thing shone in the torchlight, in the candlelight. A lot of tapestries that have survived actually do have gold and silver woven into them, but they've tarnished over time because they weren't pure gold and they weren't pure silver. So they have tarnished over time. And so you can't necessarily see it anymore. But here, I guarantee you, these tapestries were purpose woven. And therefore, they are still gleaming. They are not tarnished yet. So just imagine the effect. These white and blue, bright white, bright blue woolen hangings sandwiched between these colorful and resplendently shining tapestries. It must have been amazing. Ashley, thank you for joining. Hope to see you back. Hope to see you back again. Right, so we've got the white and the blue. We've got these gold and silver woven tapestries. And then the tapestries, let me see, the tapestries, as he says, I do not believe that such a large and costly tapestry has ever been seen. I mean, okay, that possibly is true, actually, in this case. The room was lit by candelabra made of wood, painted white and blue, from the two ends of the room, there were hung two chandeliers, which were very subtly made, since in each of the structures a man could be hidden. The chandeliers were made up like castles, and their bases were high rocks and mountains, which were subtly made. And on the paths which led around the rocks, one could see figures on foot or on horseback, men and women, and an assortment of beasts, which were very well made and subtly done. At the base of each of the chandeliers were 7 very large mirrors, so well constructed that one could see everything that was happening in the room through these mirrors. The mountains were covered with trees, grass, leaves, and flowers. They were certainly admired and looked at by everyone. They were made by a very ingenious man called Master Jean Scoquin, canon, let me see, that's probably French, sorry, called Master Jean Scoquin, canon of Saint-Pierre of Lille. For several days, Scoquin had men placed in the chandeliers who made half of them turn as briskly as windmills. Dragons jumped out of the rocks, spewing fire and flames in a very strange way, and one could not see at all how the contrivance worked. At the end of the room, in front of the main door, 2 large platforms, one on top of the other, had been made, decorated with fine tapestries, to seat and install the ladies and damsels who had come to see the feast, but who kept their identities hidden. So many fascinating things about this. First off, on a practical level, candelabra made of wood painted white and blue. These wooden candelabra are depicted in René's Book of the Tournament, in the Helmschale scene, the scene where they're judging the crests, the torsos and the mantles and the crests and the helmets. If you look at the chandeliers, they're actually these candelabra, they're wooden, right? I have 3 sets of these, 4 sets of these actually replicated from the ones that are depicted in René's Book of the Tournament. And here we have documentary evidence that if you want, you could paint them, right? They're painted blue and white here. Blue and white are the colors of Burgundy, actually. Yeah. Okay, Casa Bardici at Penzik was indeed an impressive temporary structure. It was indeed. And complex, including a massive dance floor and a small house with a 2nd story. Yeah. Angelica, I used to lead the afternoon ball at Casa Bardici and the evening dancing at Hoity Toity. 100%. I miss it so much. Yeah. Okay. So then the chandeliers. OMG, these chandeliers. My God. So the chandeliers were made like castles, right? And the bases were high rocks and mountains. And subtly, I know they've translated this into modern English incorrectly. I'm confident it's subtil, which in 15th century French which this would have been a French chronicle, it means refined, sophisticated is what it actually means. Sophisticated, not subtle, not subtle at all. There is nothing subtle about these goddamn chandeliers. Excuse my language. They are not subtle. They are sophisticated. I should have found the original French. Anyway, I'm confident though it's sophisticated. So, you've got these castles and they've got horseback and men and women riding around them, and they've got dragons that breathe fire, and these mirrors. They have mirrors at the base of the chandeliers, 7 large mirrors that will also reflect the light. So this room, this hall would have been amazingly illuminated. It would have been stunning. But what's interesting is they set up a platform where ladies and damsels, so ladies and maidens, matrons and maidens basically, who had come to see the feast could keep their identities hidden. They could watch the court, they could observe the court and keep their identities hidden. Very interesting. Okay, I think we will pick up with more of this next week, because we haven't even gotten to the feast yet. We've just got to some of the decorations and the setup for the amazing wedding feast of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold. Okay, any questions about this reading thus far, about the procession, about the clothing, about the wondrous things? While I give you a chance to ask questions, I will say I am fascinated that they actually mention by name the inventor, the tinkerer, the engineer who made these amazing chandeliers, right? That they actually mention him by name also underscores the respect that the court of Burgundy had for artisans, for the amazing things they made. And if you've ever seen a collection of artifacts that belonged to Charles the Bold, the last Duke of Burgundy, if you ever really, in my opinion, the last real Duke of Burgundy. Anyway, if you ever look at the collection of things he had, the amazing gold work, the pride of goldsmiths everywhere, you will really fully understand what I mean by their appreciation, the Duke and the Duchess's appreciation for the artisans as well as the things that they could make. Yeah. Okay, moving on to our final reading of medieval story time. So we're now into the opposite of everything we've just finished reading. We are now to the opposite of refined and erudite and courtly. And we are moving back into the world of 14th century Italy to Il Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Giovanni Boccaccio is basically, he's a contemporary, but also predates a slight predecessor of Geoffrey Chaucer. And he is the first, as far as I'm aware, to compile basically what are medieval folktales into one novel, into one book, and give it a frame. And then to compose this in the vernacular. So I don't know of anyone who compiled such a work before that. I think Boccaccio might be the innovator of that model. Geoffrey Chaucer picks up on it. Then Les Cent Nouvelles is in the 15th century, continues on with that. And then the Heptameron, right? All of that all comes back to Giovanni Boccaccio. And the basic frame is that it's during the Black Death. This group of 10 aristocrats from Florence flee to the countryside, to Fiesole, which at the time was 5 massive miles away from Florence, but now is basically a suburb of Florence. Please, if you're from Fiesole, don't hate me for saying that. And they take up residence at the villa of one of their one of the members of their company, and they spend 10 days delighting and trying to pretend that the plague isn't happening. And each day, a monarch for the day is appointed, and that monarch controls the flow of events for the day, but also controls the storytelling. And every day, they are each expected to tell one story. So 10 days, 10 stories equals 100 stories, hence les 100 nouvelles, right? So yeah, it's each of the days seems to generally have a theme, but the themes can be sometimes might be considered inappropriate to a modern audience, or definitely too far gauche to actually, say the words aloud. So we're moving on to the 9th day, the 10th novel. Last week we had Last week we had the tale of Masetto in the nunnery outside of Alexandria, right? And this week we have an equally bawdy tale. The 10th novel, The Ninth Day. In just reproof of such foolish men as will be governed by overlight belief. Okay, let me move on to where the story actually starts. Okay. I will therefore tell you a tale, which shall not be of any great length, whereby you may comprehend how carefully such things should be observed, which are commanded by them, as can affect matters by the power of enchantment, and how little delayance also ought to be in such as would not have an enchantment be hindered. About a year already past since, there dwelt at Barletta an honest man, called John de Barolo, who, because he was of poor condition for maintenance in his contented estate, provided himself of a mule to carry commodities from place to place, where fairs and markets were in request, but most especially to Apulia, buying and selling in the nature of a petty chapman. Traveling thus to thorough the countries, he grew into great and familiar acquaintance with one who named himself Pietro da Tresanti, following the same trade of life as he did, carrying his commodities upon an ass. In the scene of amitié, according to the country's custom, he never termed him otherwise than by the name of Gossip Pietro, and always when he came to Barletta, he brought him to his own house, taking it as his inn, entreating him very friendly and in the best manner he could devise to do. On the other side, Gossip Pietro, being very poor, having but one simple habitation in the village of Tresanti, hardly sufficient for him, and an handsome young woman which he had to his wife, as also his ass. Evermore, when John de Barolo came to Tresanti, he would bring him to his poor abiding with all his uttermost ability of entertainment in due acknowledgment of the courtesy he afforded to him at Barletta. But when he came to take repose in the night season, Gossip Pietro could not lodge him as gladly as he would, because he had but one silly bed, wherein himself and his wife lay. So that John de Barolo was fain to lie on a little straw in a small stable close adjoining by his own mule and the ass. The woman, understanding what good and honest welcome Gossip John afforded her husband, when he came to Barletta, was often very willing to go lodge with an honest neighbor of hers, called Carapresa di Giudicileo, because the two gossips might both lie together in one bed, wherewith divers times she acquainted her husband, but by no means would he admit it. At one time, among the rest, as she was making the same motion again to her husband, that his friend might be lodged in better manner, Gossip John thus spake to her: Good Zita Carapresa, never molest yourself for me, because I lodge to my own contentment, and so much the rather in regard that whatsoever I list, I can convert my mule into a fair young woman to give me much delight in the night season, and afterward make her a mule again, thus that I am never without her company. The young woman, wondering at these words, and believing he did not fable in them, she told them to her husband, with this addition beside: Pietro, quoth she, if he be such a dear friend to thee, as thou hast often avouched to me, wish him to instruct thee in so rare a cunning that thou mayst make a mule of me. Then shalt thou have both an ass and a mule to travel withal about thy business, whereby thy benefit will be double. And when we return home to our house, then thou mayst make me thy wife again, and in the same condition as I was before. Gossip Pietro, who was indeed but a very coxcomb, believed all the words to be true, yielding therefore the more gladly to her advice, and moving the matter to his gossip John, to teach him such a wonderful secret, which would redound so greatly to his benefit. But John began to dissuade him from it, as having spoken it in merriment, yet perceiving that no contradiction would serve to prevail, thus he began. Seeing you will needs have it so, let us rise tomorrow morning before day, as in our travel we used to do, and then I will shew you how it is to be done. Only I must and do confess that the most difficult thing of all the rest is to fasten on the tail, as thou shalt see. Gossip Pietro and his wife could hardly take any rest at all the night long, so desirous were they to have the day done. And therefore, when it drew towards day, up they arose, and calling Gossip John, he came presently to them in his shirt. And being in the chamber with them, he said, I know not any man in the world to whom I would disclose this secret, but to you. And therefore, because you so earnestly desire it, I am the more willing to do it. Only you must consent to do whatsoever I say, if you are desirous to have it done. Faithfully they promised to perform all, whereupon John, delivering a lighted candle to Gossip Pietro to hold in his hand, said, Mark well what I do, and remember all the words I say, but be very careful that whatsoever thou hearest or seest, thou do not speak one word, for then the enchantment will be utterly overthrown. Only wish that the tale may be well set on, for therein consisteth all the cunning. Gossip Pietro, holding the candle, and the woman being prepared as John had appointed her, she bowed herself forwardest with her hands set to the ground, even as if she stood upon 4 feet. First, with his hands, he touched her head and face, saying, Here is the goodly head of a mule. Then, handling her dishevelled hair, termed them the goodly manna of a mule. Afterwards, touching the body, arms, legs, and feet, gave them all the apt names for those parts belonging to a mule, nothing else remaining, but only the forming of the tail, which when Pietro perceived how John was preparing to fasten it on, having no way misliked all his former proceeding, he called to him, saying, Forbear, Gossip John, my mule shall have no tail at all. I am contented to have her without a tail. How now, Gossip Pietro, answered John. What hast thou done? Thou hast marred all by this unadvised speaking, even when the work was almost fully finished. It is no matter, Gossip, answered Pietro. I can like my mule better without a tail than to see it set on in such a manner. The fond young woman, more covetously addicted to gain and commodity, than looking in the knavish intention of her gossip John, began to grow greatly offended. Beast, as thou art, quoth she to her husband, why hast thou overthrown both thine own good fortune and mine? Didst thou ever see a mule without a tail? Wouldst thou have had him make me a monster? Thou art wretchedly poor, and when we might have been enriched forever by a secret known to none but ourselves, thou art the ass, thou hast defeated all, and made thy friend to become thine enemy. Gossip John began to pacify the woman with solemn protestations of his still continuing friendship, albeit afterwards there was no further desiring of any more mule making. But Gossip Pietro fell to his former trading only with his ass, as he was no less himself, and he went no more with Gossip John to the fairs in Apulia, neither did he ever request to have the like piece of service done for him. Although there was much laughing at this novel, the ladies understanding it better than Dionaeus intended that they should have done, yet himself scarcely smiled. But the novels being all ended and the sun beginning to lose his heat, the queen also knowing that the full period of her government was come, dispossessing herself of the crown. Did we lose connection? I know not my phone did the most strange thing. Um, yeah. So I don't know how much of that you all picked up about the conversion of the wife to the mule. Um, yeah, but the whole novel is all focused on in just reproof of such foolish men as will be governed by overlight belief. Yeah. So it is definitely a bit of a naughty story, but it is short and it is funny. I should have led with the idea of gossip. Gossip is actually the devolution, the evolution of the word godsip. And a godsip was a word either for a god brother or a god sister or a god son or a god daughter, but it also was used often as a term in 15th century language anyway. It was used, even though this is the 16th century or 17th century translation, but godsip in the 14th and 15th century had the meaning of sort of like chosen, could have the meaning of chosen brothers or chosen sisters. So they could just as easily have said brother, except that that could be confusing with, brother as in a friar in a convent, for instance. So yeah. I don't know. I don't know why on earth it did that. Yeah, literally my phone turned off, which it shouldn't do. There's no reason it should have done that. Anyway. Oh goodness, let me see if I've missed. Nope. Okay. Just missed a couple of seconds. Okay. Did you all hear the end of the story? How how gossip Pietro refused to let his wife be fully turned into a mule with a tail given to her, and how they never went to fairs again together, nor did he ever request for his wife to be turned into a mule again. Yeah, so gossip in this case does not mean that they're gossips. Like they're not they're not scolds. They don't have loose lips, right? They're basically like brothers to each other. Yeah. So that's what that means. So it's a funny little body story, right? It's just these are the kinds of stories that they tell each other. But what I love is at the end, and maybe this was the part you may have all missed. At the end, it says, after the story is over, Gossip John never ever requested to have the like piece of service done for him again, right? And then it says, although there was much laughing at this novel, the ladies understanding it better than Dionysius intended that they should have done, yet he himself scarcely smiled. So the implication being that these noble ladies, even though they are single, none of them are married, these noble ladies understood exactly what was going on in the story. Yeah, I'm not seeing any comment at all, unfortunately, Susan. I think maybe, the red line might be it didn't come through because it froze. That might be what that means. You might have to try to resend it, maybe, is what that might mean. Yeah. So yeah. I just love this little bit at the end. Although there was much laughing at the novel, the ladies understanding better than the man who told the story intended that they should have done. Meaning he thinks they're too innocent to understand, and they are clearly not. Which I just think is fantastic that in the 14th century, this is what I mean by medieval people were not prudes, not even at the class of the nobility, right? They were a lusty people across all levels of society, wed and unwed. And so the idea that, people were puritanical in the Middle Ages, sure, there were absolutely some priests and friars and preachers who absolutely wanted to see a tightly buttoned up world of perfect morality, but that was not how the people were. Yeah. Okay, any questions about our tale, the 10th novel on the 9th day? John de Barolo, at the insistence and request of his gossip Pietro de Trasante, made an enchantment to have his wife become a mule. And when it came to the fastening of the tail, gossip Pietro, by saying she should have no tail at all, spoiled the whole enchantment. Oh, so it looks like YouTube has been having some problems in general the last couple of days, so that wouldn't surprise me. Were there baddies? Adrian, I don't know. Depends on what you mean by baddies, right? Yeah. Okay. So let me just scroll up and see if I missed anything. Very good. Well, are there any last chance for any questions or comments about our reading from Boccaccio's Decameron? Like I said, I think my favorite part is the bit at the end where the ladies laugh raucously and the person who told the story doesn't. And it's very clear that the ladies understand exactly what was happening. Yeah. So yeah, just let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will be posting pictures of today's readings front and back, so you can have the or the title page and the ISBN, because not all of them have front and back. Won't help you with this version of Boccaccio's Decameron, right? Otherwise, we have tomorrow, roughly the same time, a little bit earlier, actually, is the Medieval Buzz with Philip. We'll be talking about news from the world of archaeology and medieval history. And we'll also be reviewing a documentary that came out about the woman who helped found Iceland. Right. And we'll be discussing some of the wonderfully misogynist comments that people were making in response to that documentary, Fragile Masculinity for the Loss. And then I will probably be doing some more other unplanned random medieval sewing parties throughout the week, so stay tuned for that. I also have scheduled for this week my Zoom sessions, my Zoom sewing sessions and creative live sessions with my patrons and my channel members. Oh crap, it's on I can't look at my calendar. It is this week though. So if you would like to interact with me live so we can see each other and talk using our words, you can show me the projects you're working on, get advice from me, and we can actually socialize in a much more direct manner, then become a patron or a channel member, and you can join in our monthly live sessions. But becoming a patron or a channel member comes with a host of other perks, including extra content that I don't share publicly, full tutorials, extra digital resources. I have a Discord for my patrons and my channel members. So if you have the financial means and would like to support me and benefit from all those extras, then do consider becoming a channel member and or a patron. And I would therefore like to thank my channel members and patrons. Some of you are here this evening, morning, afternoon. Some of you will be watching the recording. I really appreciate how you go the extra mile. I appreciate all of you who've left super chats for me. That's super fantastic as well. I'm honored that you all have decided to support me in all the various ways, including just watching all my videos, hitting the thumbs up, and leaving a comment all the way through to the financial end. I'm honored that you've decided to come with me on the journey of building this community of my court, as I'm calling it, of exploring medieval material culture across the world and trying to get a deeper, more hands-on understanding of the past. Yeah. Let me see. Oh, you're in Houston? I am. Where is the lady taking place? Right. So I am currently in Korea, actually. I am in Joseon, in fact. Okay. Dowager Duchess Isabella of Burgundy was John of Gaunt's granddaughter. Her mother was Philip. No, not that. Not that. Oh, yes. Yes. You're thinking of, I think you're thinking of a different Isabella of Burgundy. I'm talking about Isabella of Portugal. Although she would have been, yes, Philippa of Lancaster. Yeah. She married into the Portuguese throne. Yep, you're right. Let me see. Here in Houston. Okay. Otherwise, are there any final questions or comments? Otherwise, all the excitement for the rest of the week. Medieval Buzz tomorrow, my live Zoom session for my patrons and channel members, random medieval sewing parties. This weekend will be more medieval sewing parties plus medieval cooking with the Contessa. So yeah, lots of fun live streaming activity planning. Yep, currently in South Korea in the land of Joseon. Please do like and subscribe. And if you have the time and the patience afterwards, when the video posts, if you just pop even just an emoji in the comments, remember leaving a comment under the video triggers the algorithm and helps grow my channel and make sure I can keep doing this for years to come. Yeah. Till next time, everyone, may your adventures be creative. Thank you all for joining me. Bye, everyone.